This is my midterm for philosophy of mind. So, for the first question on the mind, I'm going to be doing non-reductive physicalism versus reductive physicalism. And reductive physicalism is the worst of the two in my mind. I'm very pro non-reductive physicalism simply because of how complex certain processes can be and how out there abstract thought really is. And the book gives an example on page 28 of stocks and how, when you're in the stock market, you're dealing with um, certain complex mental states and whatnot, but you're also dealing with certain complex social realities. So not only are you dealing with a concept of money, it's not a it's a physical contract almost that I agree to give you this, and in return you'll give me this sort of thing instead of the barter system. But you're also dealing with the social complexities of credit, which is I'll give you money, imaginary money, in exchange for more money, imaginary money, sort of thing. So, and credit is an even more abstract part of economics. Um, and on top of that, there are certain things that I think are even more abstract than the said example. I think imaginary creatures are fairly out there. So, for example, there's this game called Subnautica, and the premise is you crash on an alien planet, and it's an ocean planet. And in order to survive, you have to explore the ocean. And there are some creatures in there that are so bizarre and alien that it astounds me that someone could imagine them. Someone could create this weird little creature. And on top of that, even if you're going to say, okay, well, we can introduce some of these physical traits, maybe tentacles or fins or whatever, and those are experiential to um, organisms on Earth. Um, there are certain things that are even more abstract, like death. So we can be aware of death. We can have a concept of death. We can sort of understand death, but we can't really truly understand what it's like to die. So, like, maybe I could be aware of the pain of organ failure. I don't know. I've never gone through it. Or um, maybe if it's drowning, I know what it's like to have almost drown. I've had that experience. But so maybe if we're gonna give that specific example, I could understand what it's like to die or come close to dying at least, and I have a certain awareness of that experience. But I don't know what it's like to be dead, and I can't know what it's like to be dead until I'm dead, and it's just something that we can't fully understand. I mean, we can understand what it's like after death. We understand the afterlife, whether there be heaven, hell, or Valhalla, but we can't fully understand death. So it's certain abstracts like that I don't believe you can fully reduce down to the physical. And even granting that you could, there are far too many variables. There are far too many variables. You'd have to map out every single one year on out of billions, and also know the infinite amount um, um, of sequences it takes to create those certain mental states. And I don't think it's possible for us to ever get to a point where we can empirically prove that. And so for the next question, um, contrasting higher order theory with multiple draft theory, and I like how both are again physicalist, and they deal with the psychological. But the biggest thing for me on multiple draft theory and higher order theory is how we understand consciousness. And I think awareness is probably fundamental to that consciousness. I think it's far more fundamental than behavior or communication, because I can be fully conscious and give no indication that I am. I can stare off into space and think about, philosophy of mind and consciousness without, indicating any behavior or communicating that I am conscious, just like just now. And another good example is sleeping. So, when you sleep, your body goes into sleep paralysis so that when you're dreaming and there's a 2 foot tall pink fuzzy monster chasing you, you don't run into the wall since you're scared to death of that pink fuzzy monster. But, so that's another example of where you seem to be conscious, and because you have memories and you're aware of those dreams, and in some instances you can even control the outcome of those dreams, but you're not giving any indication that you are conscious. And I think that's one of the biggest parts of consciousness is awareness that we're conscious. So like on page 77, they sum it up pretty well for higher order theory. More concretely, I am conscious of that chair in front of me when I have an unconscious thought that I am perceiving a chair. So it's that awareness of our unconscious perceptions that is key to consciousness in my mind. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's the only level of consciousness we can have. I mean, maybe there's multiple levels of consciousness. Maybe being awake is a level of consciousness. But I think when we think of interactive consciousness, there's a level of interaction and there's a level of awareness that are necessary. And I think awareness is far more important than that interaction part of it. And finally, for question number 3, I'm comparing and contrasting the narrative self and self as the center of narrative gravity. And again, I like how both of these are physicalist, and I like how they try to deal with those psychological and social aspects. I also think it's really interesting how you do the inverse. Maybe we didn't grow up telling stories because it's not stories didn't come first. Maybe it's that view that where the protagonist came first, and so stories followed. I think that's an interesting way to flip it. Maybe not everybody. Maybe it's just me that always thought the inverse of it. But so anyway, I'm pro narrative self simply because it allows for more agency. Because a robot can't have that kind of agency, and Dennett's view, or is it Dennett, or the narrative, the self as a narrative center of gravity. The robot can't have any type of agency because it's determined by the random numbers generators in its processors. So, no matter what it does, it's been determined by randomness to do said actions, and so in order to make sense of it all, it creates a narrative for itself. But I'm very leaning the other way simply because it allows for more agency. It doesn't allow for the most agency, but at the same time, I am inclined to think that there's some truth behind that limited agency because, I was very lucky to be born into a society where, and not only just that sort of American society where there's freedom of liberties and freedoms and liberties and such, but also a place in that society where I can have a lot more choices than most people. So, I can choose to go to college if I want to. I can choose between certain jobs that I want if I, when I get talking with businesses. It's more than just working at the McDonald's. That is hopefully in store for me. But I think there's a lot of truth to those sort of societal barriers. Not everybody is born in a small town with white skin and blue eyes and blonde hair. Some people are born in the inner city where cops don't necessarily trust you or believe in you, and you don't grow up with those cops. You grow up having a bad relationship with the police force, and maybe worse yet, some places you grow up working in a sweatshop all your life and you die at the age of 12 because you were overworked, or you know, died because of fume inhalation or something, or died in a mine, horrible things, and you had no choice in the matter. So I'm definitely very lucky, but I also believe those social barriers are real. It's just a part of the world we live in, sadly. But maybe that whole narrative self thing, it has more to do with, actually, maybe the narrative self is more to do with an American society, simply because of how individualistic we are. I didn't really grow up in a uber communal society. I grew up in America where we've never lost a war except for Vietnam and some of the Indian wars and a couple others. But greatest nation on earth. So